I just wanted to work you up to this point. And what we can do here with this post-trade quantity with quantity is we can state whether or not we want a payment or an asset transfer transaction. So we state the asset to list, we state the asset request, and what we can do is make this an arc4 uint64 instead of an asset. And this way, we can state that if we want algo, this number will be 0. Otherwise, it will be the asset ID of what we want. And then here in the fulfill trade request quantity with quantity, instead of having them pass in an asset transfer transaction as an argument, we can actually access the group transaction at the first index and see if it's a payment or an asset transfer transaction. And we're going to state here, if G transaction dot group transaction at index 0, and this will just get the group index, is equal to G transaction dot payment transaction, then we will proceed as if it's a payment transaction. And then elif the group transaction position 0 is equal to an asset transfer transaction. We're going to treat it as if they're paying with an asset. And the assert statements will make sure that all of this occurs appropriately. So the first thing is we can do all of this stuff in the same way before this if-elif. And over here, if it's an asset transfer, then we'll do all of this. And we're going to confirm here, instead of asset trade fulfillment being manually indicated, we're going to state here G transaction, the group transaction at position 0, we're going to create an instance of an asset transfer transaction from the transaction at position 0 and confirm that the asset amounts is equal to the asset amount requested. And if it's not, and same thing here. So what we can do actually is state here the asset transfer transaction or asset payment transaction or the asset trade fulfillment transaction is equal to an instance of an asset transfer transaction from the first transaction in this group. And then we can use this over here and this over here. And then we transfer. And then if it's not, and the first transaction is a payment, then we're going to say payment fulfillment. Then we're going to assert that the listing value dot asset listed is still the asset listed ID. Then we're going to assert that the listing value dot asset requested dot native is equal to 0, which represents Algorand. And then we're going to assert that the payment fulfillment transaction, and we need to change this to payment transaction, dot amounts is equal to the listing value dot asset amount requested. And we can even change this to amounts requested. We also need to insert a payment transaction, and the receiver will be the listing name dot lister dot native. So we get an account. The amounts will be the listing value dot asset amount requested dot native. And the fee will be the global dot minimum transaction fee. And we also need to transfer the asset to the buyer. And since the payment transaction will auto-complete this listing, we can then delete this listing box and return string buyer paid with algo listing fulfilled. And down here, trade request fulfilled, lister can now claim asset. And let's compile this. And what we can do is over here, instead of doing all this nonsense, we can just assert, or we can say if G transaction payment transaction at index 0, and elif G transaction asset transfer transaction at index 0. Remove this part. So we'll just set the payment fulfillment or the asset trade fulfillment to the asset transfer or payment transaction at that index. Okay. Expression is always true, so that's going to be an issue. So what we can do is this. If G transaction at position 0 is equal to G transaction dot payment transaction, and the same thing here, if G transaction at index 0 is equal to asset transfer transaction dot type and dot type and dot type dot type. So there's a transaction type class we can import from AlgoPy, and we're going to try that instead. Payments. And then the same thing here. Asset transfer. We have an error here. Line 69, or excuse me, this asset request directly. And let's see. Perfect. And then we also need to submit our payment. So what we did here is we imported a transaction type class from AlgoPy, and we are checking if the first transaction is an asset transfer type or a payment transaction type. And this is so that we can have a universal type of listing where if the requested asset is 0, then this is allowed. If it's not, it's going to be an actual asset listed ID or asset trade fulfillment asset ID. And that would mandate that the asset transfer is at the 0th index of the group. And then we will complete the final iteration of this. Rename these as well. So post universal listing, and we can call this universal trade listing. And post universal listing, fulfill universal listing, claim universal listing, and cancel universal listing. And let's recompile. So now we can try this. So universal listing, we're going to try these twice. So universal listing, let's try inputting. Instead of asset 2, we're going to input 0 and state 1 algo, or let's do 2 algo. And we changed the method name, so we're going to start with post universal listing. So over here, I'm going to change that. Now let's confirm the asset to list, asset request quantity, so these all match. Perfect. And let's run this here. We need a new contract first. And to compile these changes we made. Let's post the app ID here. Let's try a universal listing. So when we indicate 0, that means that it's going to be a payment transaction at this fulfillment step. So in this scenario, universal fulfillment, we won't need the trigger opt-in if it's a payment. And then we're going to do a payment transaction, which we can grab from here, the number 3. So asset payment. And go back to universal fulfillment. So this will be when we need to send an asset, but the first example we're using is where we pay with algo, and I believe we requested 2 algo. Yes. Oh, this would need to be in micro algo. So we're going to adjust that here. So if it's micro algo, we need to do 2 million, not 2. So let's go back here. And we're going to make a new listing. And we're going to send 2 million micro algo or 2 algo here. And change the name of the method, which is now fulfill universal listing. And wrap asset payment, asset transfer fee, asset listed. And let's give this a try. It's going to be counter number 2. See how this works out. unused arguments specified as a trade fulfillment. And this is because for fulfillment, we removed it as an argument because it could be either a payment or an asset transfer. So we're going to manually add it to our atomic transaction composer. And let's give that a shot. Unavailable account. So since we're going to be transferring to a new account, the lister, we need to include a foreign accounts array. And state here in a list the lister address. Perfect. And then we're going to test with a listing for an asset request. So here, we're going to replace 0 with the actual asset 2 that we want. And let's say we want 3 of these. And we post a new listing. And then for universal fulfillment, we're going to comment out these now, or just this one. The asset payment will now be an asset transfer. And with asset transfers, we need to opt the contract in, so we'll keep this in here. And we need to send 3, as we indicated previously. And let's give this a shot here. Seems to check out. And we're going to be dealing with listing number 3 now. And I just realized, so the reason we're getting this error here, which we saw over here, b to I is not equal. The number of transactions we submit, the 0th transaction will not actually be the asset payment. So if we look here, the first transaction we submit is this payment to the contract for it to opt in for an asset transfer. So we need to prepare for a situation where the first transaction might not be a payment transaction, as we have here. So the asset payment will be the first transaction, since we don't need to have the contract opt in to an asset that we're sending. So instead of just going by whether or not the first transaction is going to be a payment or an asset transfer, since asset transfers mandate that we include these 2 transactions before them, we're also going to do the group length. So here we have the payment, the opt-in, the asset payment, so that's 3. Then we have the fee payment, that's 4. And then we have the application call, that's 5. So we have 5 transactions when we do asset-to-asset payments. And then if we don't have an asset-to-asset payment, it's going to be the payment transaction for the asset payment, that's 1. Then the fee payment, that's 2. And then the application call, that's 3. So if it's 3 transactions in the group, that means we're paying for the asset with algo. If it's 5 transactions, then it means that we're paying for the asset with an asset. So what we can add here is, instead of just checking if the first transaction is a payment or an asset transfer, so we can use if global.groupSize modulo 3 is equal to 0, or we don't have to get that complicated. If global.groupSize is equal to 3, then we can assert that the first transaction is going to be a payment. Then if elif global.groupSize is equal to 5, we can assert that the transaction at index 2, or the third transaction, is an asset transfer. And then we should also assert that the payment, or let's go down here, the payment fulfillment transaction dot receiver is equal to the current application address. We forgot to add that. And the same thing here, but for the asset trade fulfillment transaction. And we'll save. Receiver, asset trade, fulfillment is going to be asset receiver. And then let's launch our contract. Paste the new app ID in our .env. And we're going to experiment again with the first type of listing. So we're going to assume it's algo again. So we're going to say to algo, and the asset requested is going to be 0 for algo, so no asset ID. And when we use asset request quantity for algo, it needs to be in micro algo. Let's create a second listing here. And counter will now be 2. And this should succeed. And then we're going to try with a universal listing for asset 2. And we want, so let's say, 3 of this asset. And we also need to go in here, make counter 3. Let's run this. And now we want asset 2, 3 of them. So we're going to remove our payment transaction. So we can just comment out our payment transaction and use our asset transfer. And we stated we want 3. So 3 of asset index 2 is our payment. Let's give this a run here. And we also need to change this here. Since we're checking transaction 2, we need to pull transaction 2 as the asset trade fulfillment. And now I promise we're definitely good. Save, enter. And we can go straight to trying the asset transfer. We don't need to do the payment again. So let's do a launch first. Paste in the new app ID. So let's do a universal listing for an asset again. 3 of asset 2. Let's try a fulfillment. Counter number 1, since this is the first listing. And then we can try another algo payment. Let's do a listing for an algo request. And let's fulfill the algo request. Perfect. And lastly, we're going to try a cancellation. So we can just use this again. We're out of asset 1. I think it only minted 10. So let's try doing 1. And then let's try a cancellation here. And we need to change the API method name to universal cancellation. Cancel universal listing. Oh, and we also need to claim. So let me just cancel the one I just made. So let's go to universal cancellation. Then we'll go try the claim for the second listing, I believe. Listing number. So we made, I believe it'll be 3. Perfect. And then let's try claiming number 2. And we've already opted in to asset 2, so we should be good here. And we need to change the method name as well. For claiming. Counter 2. Maybe it was listing number 1. Yeah. So our first listing is being fulfilled now. And that's it. So the build up, and I think we got up to 450 lines of code. Even now, just a universal listing is 200 lines of code. But this, all the listing types we went over beforehand was to build up to this kind of listing, a universal trade listing, where they can request either algo or X number of assets from 1 to any number they want in exchange for 1 asset. And I know this was a long video. Let me just make sure there are no assert statements missing. But I'm glad if you did get through it. I'm really impressed. And this is a smart contract for marketplace you could use like now if you wanted to build a marketplace. But yeah, I'm really impressed if you got through this entire video. You just got through writing all the code for a marketplace. The only thing you would need is a UI and a front-end developer to make this work on a website and display all the listings, which you can get through checkboxes.